Hello again. It's good to see you, and I hope you can see me all right. Today we want to talk about Thanksgiving. It's just a few days before the holiday, and I thought it'd be a good time to do that and bring it to you today. So, um, you know, there's a song that we tend to sing at Thanksgiving. It begins with "We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing." And that's a great hymn for Thanksgiving because that's what we do on Thanksgiving. We thank God for. Generally, it used to be an agricultural society. We thank God for the harvest and the blessings that He's given us. And, we should do that today too. Just remember Him. And that's what we do. The fourth Thursday of every November, we remember this, the giving of God. So I'm going to start to read to you now from a book here, and it's called A Family Book, Thanksgiving, A Time to Remember, and it's written by Barbara Rainey, if I can get it in the camera right there, by Barbara Rainey and everything. It's a wonderful book. It's a short book. I'm not going to read you the whole part. I'm going to read you a condensed version because it might take too long if we do that. Well, it starts out with the Pilgrim story. The Pilgrim story doesn't just start with the ship. It actually goes back to the Church of England. Now, the Church of England had become kind of corrupt. It had left the Word of God and everything. So two groups of people developed out of the Church of England. One of them were called separatists. Now, separatists, they were the people that thought this church is gone so far from the Word of God that we need to separate ourselves from that. And so they did. They separated themselves and they started to form their own church groups. The other group that formed were the Puritans. Now, they realized the church was bad too, but they hoped to stay in the church and purify the church. So they were called Puritans for that. Now, the Pilgrims, they came from the group that were the separatists. And what happened to them is they separated themselves from the Church of England, and in doing so, I guess they gathered the wrath of the leaders of the church and of the government in England there, who harassed them, and they would meet together in small meetings and homes and such, and the Church of England sent spies in among them, and eventually some of them were arrested or pressured or fined. Some of them were even put to death in an effort to stop this. So finally, after about 15 years of this, they moved to another country in Holland, and in Holland they had to work. Since they were foreigners, they couldn't get good jobs. They had to take menial jobs. And they work about 12 to 14 hours a day for 6 days a week, but they had Sunday off and they were allowed to worship. And so they were pleased with that, and they gave God thanks for that. And they were pleased with that. But after about 10 years on the Dutch soil, a lot of the church members that had come from England, they decided to explore the possibility of going to America. They heard in America that, they would have freedom to worship. Now, they understood that it was very expensive to go to America, and it was very dangerous to go to America. Not only did they have to cross the ocean, but when they got there, they'd have to enter an uncivilized world. No buildings waiting for them, and they'd have to start from scratch over there. The land was different. Maybe the crops would be different. The climate would be somewhat different, and everything like that. And not only that, but there may be Indians there too. They'd heard stories about some of the people that had tried and really got killed over there, but just by the Indians alone. So it was a hard decision for them to know, right? So this group, they decided that they were going to head for America, and I think I turned one page too far here. Let me turn back a little bit. All right. They decided they're going to go to America. And so the book starts out here as the small beginnings of the Pilgrims. It says, the Mayflower was a small wooden ship with billowing sails, and it was a vessel that God used to bring a group of Christian believers to an unseen land far over the Atlantic. These Christian men and women called themselves pilgrims. A pilgrim is someone who goes on a journey to a destination, usually because of their religious beliefs. Now, these pilgrims, they believed that God was leading them to establish a new community where they could worship freely. The worship part, that was the essential thing that drew them and drove their lives and brought them to America. They were looking to be able to worship God unhindered with that. So in September of 1620, after enduring many delays and difficulties, these pilgrims finally said their last goodbyes. They boarded the Mayflower and they set sail for the New World. That sounds like a kind of easy beginning, but it's actually a little more difficult than that. When they left Holland, they came to England, and it says here the Pilgrim band of approximately 46 people, only 46 pilgrims, first had to sail from Holland to England on a ship named the Speedwell. Now, after saying their goodbyes on July 22nd, way back in July in the year 1620, the small ship headed across the English Channel to the seaport of Southampton. There, the Speedwell docked at a slip next to a larger ship painted brown and gold. That was the Mayflower. It already had on board Captain Jones and a crew and about 60 to 70 volunteers who had been recruited in England to give the new colony a larger population. Some of these volunteers, they wanted religious freedom, but some of them just wanted, to come over and work with the Pilgrims a while and get their own land and start a new life over there with that too. One of the hired helpers, though, was a Captain Miles Standish. He was an ex-soldier, and he was going to play an important role in the protection of the Pilgrims, in case they ran into problems with the Indians and such over there. So now the Mayflower and that other ship, the Speedwell, they left port on August 5th in 1620. And that was kind of late in summer, because by the time they get over to America, it would probably be late September already. And, that's pretty late to start building a house from scratch. It's not like here where you go to the lumberyard and get the wood. There you go to the woods and you cut down a tree. And then you had to make logs out of it and, dry them out and pile them up. And there's a lot of manual labor and a hard place to do it. First, they had to find a place to do this at, right? So the first days, showed some of the things that they were up against. So first of all, some of the people got seasick right in port as they were leaving port because it was so rough in the seas, and the Speedwell began to leak, so they had to turn back. And they had to turn back, and they fixed that, and that took about another week delay or so. And they went another 300 miles out, and they got out of the port, and they went 300 miles, and again, the Speedwell began to leak. So this time they brought it back in. And after the sea repair people, the boat repair people, looked at it for a while, they decided that the Speedwell wasn't seaworthy. So they had to sell that ship, and they couldn't all fit on just the Mayflower alone, so some of the people had to volunteer to stay behind, and so that's what happened. So it says here now, so when the Mayflower finally left England, on the 6th of September, now it's really getting late. Remember, initially they wanted to leave in early July. Then they were delayed till August. Now it's September 6th. Well, they crowded on board the Mayflower with 102 passengers, including 33 children. So of the 102, they weren't all adults, right? 33 of them were children. That left you about 79 adults only. Most of the Pilgrims on the ship were in their 20s. And some in their 30s. But surprisingly, at least 15 passengers were over 40, including William and Mary Brewster, who were both in their 50s. So some of them were as old as 50. There's some things we don't want to do when we're 50. We're not 40 anymore or 30 anymore, but these two, they decided to take that. And it was a very risky thing. Well, because of all the delays, the passengers and crews had already eaten much of the food and drink that was set aside for the voyage. This meant that the supplies that were intended to be used after landing in America, these supplies would be needed for the sea journey. So they had to eat while they're waiting for the ship to go, so they used some of the supplies that they would normally go. They'd sold all their stuff. They didn't have pocket money, so to speak. It had all been tied up in the supplies to get to America and start there. But with the delay, they still had to eat, so some of those supplies got used up. They said they used up some of those supplies. While on ship, though, it says the food was terrible. Brine-soaked beef, pork, and fish, stale hard biscuits, which were often full of insects. The rats living on board helped themselves to the same food supplies. So it wasn't a nice sanitary thing at their cafeteria there, so to speak, was it? The rooms for the passengers were crowded, and they were mainly below deck. No fresh air, no sunshine, huh? Conditions were miserable. They were cramped quarters, seasick people vomiting into pails if they were able to find a pail on time. No sanitary toilets. The hatches were sealed off because of constant storms at sea, and so the passengers were not able to get any fresh air. A foul mixture of odors grew in such an environment. Could you imagine that? 102 passengers below decks with that kind of conditions. Another problem was the attitude of the seamen that sailed the Mayflower. They did not like landlubbers, so to speak, right? And they called these pilgrims, they called them psalm-singing puke stockings. I think that tells you what kind of conditions they were living in. Puke stockings. Could you imagine wearing the sock like that and walking there and stepping into that? Well, the sailors, they ridiculed the passengers taking time each morning, the passengers who were taking time each morning to recite or sing psalms and pray. One such sailor was especially nasty, cursing the ones who were sick and telling them he looked forward to throwing them overboard if they died on the voyage. Boy, that's how'd you like to be on there, crowded on the ship with such loving, caring drivers there. So, about 2 weeks out to sea, however, this sailor unexpectedly developed a raging fever, and within just one day, he died of unknown causes. And he was cursing even as he breathed his last breath. His shrouded body was buried at sea, and this sobered up the other seamen, who were a superstitious group in normal circumstances. They wondered if this fellow crewman had died because of his treatment of the humble and God-fearing pilgrims. So, not wanting to risk any further fate, the more superstitious sailors no longer ridiculed their passengers. Wow. So now the Mayflower, it says the Mayflower was nearly halfway across the Atlantic when it met a ferocious storm. The winds wailed at 50 miles an hour, and the waves towered 50 feet or higher. Can you imagine? The waves were as high as the ship was long with that. The waves' vicious pounding opened cracks in the ship's wooden hull. Icy cold seawater soaked the sailors and leaked into the passenger quarters below deck. Wow. The ship rolled and tossed from side to side, with the terrified pilgrims hanging on to anything solid, crying out to God to deliver them. The storm raged on for days, and it became so intense that even the blasphemous sailors prayed. The pilgrims continued to pray and sing psalms, and their voices barely could be heard above the thundering waves and howling wind. Well, without warning, one of the huge crossbeams supporting the main deck suddenly cracked due to the constant stress of the high winds. Now the sailors were just as worried as the passengers were. But as always, the pilgrims took their concerns and fears to God, asking Him to deliver them and provide a way of escape. And God did. Their spiritual leader, William Brewster, remembered a large iron jack screw the pilgrims had brought over for lifting heavy beams when they would begin their building construction. A jack screw was like a long bolt, except it was probably an inch or inch and a quarter in diameter, and it had threads on it. And they could just take a wrench and turn a nut on there that would be under a plate and would lift the plate up, and that's how they could jack things in place with that. Right? So they went and got it, and they used it to crank up the beam to its original position, and they thanked God that it worked. So one man, his name we don't know yet, but he was a servant of John Carver, and his name was John Howland, and he became frantic after being cooped up so long during the long storm. Well, though the worst of the storm was over, the main deck was still no place for passengers who were not used to rough seas. He disobeyed both the captain's and his master's orders and went up on deck for some fresh air. The waves were still huge and sprayed frigid water over the sides. Suddenly, when the ship heeled over without warning, John fell overboard. Ooh, boy. As the young man slammed into the surface of the icy cold water and went under, he instinctively reached up with his arms, grasping for anything to hold on to. A rope happened to be trailing over the side of the ship, and by God's amazing grace, it was there when John reached out. A person can live in the North Atlantic waters in November for only about 4 minutes. I remember in the Navy, we sailed in the North Atlantic occasionally, and they told us on one trip, if you fell overboard, you'd live about 3 minutes and 34 seconds. It's just like falling into ice water. Matter of fact, the water could have been colder than freezing, but since it's salt water, it didn't freeze. It's very cold up there. Well, no one knows exactly how long John was in this cold, salty water before the sailors were able to haul him on deck. His skin was blue and he had nearly drowned, but he did survive. There's no record that he ever disobeyed an order again. Another young man, a servant by the name of William Button, he became an example to all the other passengers on the importance of obeying the captain. It appears that William refused to follow the captain's and the ship's doctor's orders to drink a spoonful of lemon juice each day. He became sick and he died. He was the only passenger to die on the voyage. His body was quickly buried at sea. The pilgrims, especially the children, they took notice of that. Now, why do you think the captain said that they were supposed to take a spoonful of lemon juice every day? I think that was to ward off rickets and stuff. They needed the vitamins. Remember English sailors, they used to call them limeys? That's because they carried lime. You know, instead of lemons, they had limes, and lime had the same kind of vitamins in there as the lemons did. And they would use that to keep away rickets and to stay healthy with that. They needed that kind of thing. And when they didn't have it, you would die. It was that important to have that on a long voyage like that. So, but in the midst of all these tragic events and hardships on the long voyage, the Pilgrims also knew some times of refreshing. A moment of joy came when one of the mothers gave birth in the smelly, crowded cabin to a baby boy. His proud father appropriately named the lad Oceanus. What a name for a child, huh? How appropriate, though. But after 10 weeks at sea, that's 2.5 months, after 10 weeks at sea, many passengers were falling ill and complaining of fever and chills and swollen limbs. The situation was grave and there was still no sign of land. The weather, however, had finally improved so that passengers could go on deck for exercise and fresh air. Captain Miles Standish, who was in charge of security and military readiness for the colony, he took this opportunity to drill the men on the basics of weaponry and tactics. Well, on November 9th, remember they'd left England the last time, I believe it was September 6th. So October 6th, November 9th, that's about 2 full months, right? With that, on November 9th, several children squealed with delight when they saw a seagull dive above the ship. Not long afterward, a sailor cried, "Land ho!" After 65 days at sea from Plymouth, a total of 97 days from the first launch in Southampton, the Pilgrims caught a glimpse of their destination, the new land where God would be worshipped freely and where in time freedom would flourish. Shouting for joy and falling to their knees to pray, they celebrated by reading Psalm 100. Let me read you Psalm 100. Psalm 100 says, "Shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful singing. Know that the Lord himself is God. It is he who has made us and not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name, for the Lord is good. His loving kindness is everlasting and his faithfulness goes to all generations." Isn't that wonderful? With land clearly in sight, the brownish bluffs and tree tops on the horizon, the Mayflower sailed slowly up the coastline, staying out to sea far enough to avoid treasure shoals and rocks near the shore. You know, the passengers, they eyed the shore, but the captain and the navigator realized this is not where they were supposed to be. It turned out they were supposed to be another 60 or 80 miles south at Jamestown or so, but instead with the storms, they drifted off northerly, and now they're at a place that was not inhabited by anyone. It didn't belong to England. It wasn't an English colony. So they wondered what to do. Well, after a lot of debate and prayer, they decided to stay there and build a settlement in what they called New England. New England. So when they made this decision, it caused some confusion. Some of them were hired to work and, work for England, not necessarily for the Pilgrims. So they had to just come to a new agreement. So for an entire day on November 10th, 1620, that's pretty close to our time, isn't it? A discussion went on in the main cabin of the Mayflower. As the ship worked its way around the tip of the cape, searching for a coastal inlet to enter and drop the anchor, the debate continued. Finally, several of the leaders drafted an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, which was to become one of the more important documents in American history. The major points of the agreement were explained to the passengers, and all adult males were asked to sign the compact before the ship dropped anchor. According to the book named The Light and the Glory, written by Peter Marshall and David Manuel, it marked the first time in recorded history that free and equal men had voluntarily covenanted together to create their own civil government. Isn't that an amazing thing? Just think about it. Throughout all the history that we know, there was always government. And when you were born under someone's government, you never were completely free. But here, this people discovered themselves in a place where there was no government. There was no country to rule. There's nothing. What did they do? Well, they had to make up a government. Why? For order. It was confusion. If the people wouldn't work together or didn't have a single plan, odds are that they'd all die. So here's a clause that's written from the Mayflower Compact. It starts saying, it starts here saying, having undertaken for the glory of God, that's what they were on this journey for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, having undertaken this voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, we do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends that were written of. So, by this time, the Mayflower had sailed beyond the end of the Cape and turned into a bay. The Pilgrims saw more clearly the landscape of sand hills and thickets of short, piney woods. But at 10 a.m., Captain Jones ordered the anchor drop. It was Saturday morning, November 11th, the year 1620. Now, William Bradford wrote later of this in his diary. He wrote, I cannot but stand amazed at this poor people's present condition. Being thus past the vast ocean and the sea of troubles, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? Isn't that something? After all that they'd already endured, it's not like they were going to a civilized country. Now they were there, and it was just them and the woods and the beach, right? And they had to make a living out of that. Fortunately, they had some supplies with them. And, eventually they sent the party of men aboard to search out the land to see what would be a suitable place to start a camp or things like that. And they were out there and they saw some Indians the first day and no incident. But the second day, the Indians started shooting at them with bows and arrows and they returned some fire, but no one was hurt. And they called that name of that place, and it's still called by this name today, they call that name the First Encounter. And that's where they did it. But in spite of all this, they were able to get their way around the bay on land and find themselves an ideal spot on mainland that had fertile soil and 4 springs-fed creeks and a large section of ground already cleared and ready for planting. And what a great discovery it was. Meanwhile, their sickness broke out back on ship, and a lot of people became very sick, and a few died, including William Bradford's young wife, Dorothy. But there wasn't time for mourning. They had to start building and stuff if they were going to make it through the winter. It wasn't until December 11th, imagine that, December 11th, a month after they had first dropped anchor, that a landing was made at what was to become the permanent settlement. Plans had been made to first build a meeting house, and then 19 family dwellings. The unmarried men having been assigned to live with families. These buildings were to be simple one-room frame houses about 18 by 14 feet in size. That's about the typical size of a living room somewhere, 14 feet by 18 feet. And it would have one fireplace and a sleeping loft. There was no glass for windows, and the roofs were made of thatch. That's, almost like oats or something like that. Not oats themselves, but straw, right? And the settlers had done that in England, built roofs out of that. Construction finally began in late December. A setback occurred when they finally had finished the main hall by mid-January, but a fire broke out and started to burn it, but they were able to put it out without losing the whole building, fortunately, with that. Perhaps, it says here, perhaps the Pilgrims had felt that the worst was over when they finally set foot on solid ground again, but their relief was only momentary. Though they were hard workers, they could not build their dwellings quickly enough, and they could only endure that harsh, cold winter weather without ill effect for so long. As the weeks went by, the weather grew worse. In the coldest stretch of winter, after many had suffered long with head colds, a flu-like illness swept through the colony. This disease was called the general sickness, and it made much of the community desperately ill. Coughing and gasping for breath, most of the settlers were unable to leave their beds. Few were spared. William Bradford, Governor Carver, and other leaders fell sick too. During the worst of the epidemic, on any given day, only 6 or 7 of the 100 colonists might be strong enough to help tend the sick. Only 6 or 7 were sick some days. The Pilgrim began to die in alarming numbers, often 2 or 3 a day. We might not consider that a large number, but just imagine if 2 die every day for a week, that's 14 people. For a month, that's 4 times 14. That'd be 52 people. That's half of their group could die in a month at that rate. Well, the men that were strong enough to work, they carried out the bodies for burial at night. This was a tactic to hide the worsening situation in the county from any Indians who might be spying from the nearby woods. So not only were they sick, but they were still concerned about the Indians. Were they friendly or were they very, very bad with that? The epidemic also struck the sailors on board the Mayflower. So now it's getting on ship too, and they had to worry about that. Well, it says February brought the worst of the weather and the sickness. Freezing rains pounded the crude dwellings, stripping much of the clay from the cracks between the boards and allowing the wailing, cold wind to penetrate the houses. Both the sick and healthy struggled to stay warm. 17 persons died during the month of February. Indians were sighted on several occasions. Since the intentions of these native people were unknown, the colonists were very fearful. Under the leadership, though, of Captain Standish, the men that were not too ill practiced military drills and shared guard duty at night. Well, hope began to grow again as the temperatures rose slightly in early March. So now they've been at this since the beginning of December, and now it's beginning of March. Let's see, December, January, February, March. So it's hitting in the 4th month. A few families began preparations for planting their crops. But the most memorable event in March, perhaps for the whole winter, was the arrival on March 16th of a single naked, or nearly naked, Indian brave. Unlike other Indians who ran away when confronted, this man walked boldly to the door of the meeting house and, to the surprise of everyone, cried out, "Welcome," in English. Well, stunned by his boldness and use of English, yet still weary of his intentions, the Pilgrims hesitantly invited him in and offered him a plate of fruit and some brandy. The Indian ate and drank enthusiastically. After his meal, the Indian informed his host that he knew English food and customs through contacts with English fishermen. The settlers learned that his name was Samoset. He was the chief of the Algonquin tribe, and his home tribe was further up the coast to the north in what is now the state of Maine. He said that the Indians who had inhabited the area where the Pilgrims were at were called Patuxets. They were a large Indian tribe who had murdered every white man who had ever landed in their territory. But 4 years before the Pilgrims arrived, the tribe suffered a mysterious plague and everyone had died. Wow, that's I think, provision from God. Where they landed was a very dangerous place. The Indians are very hostile, had killed all the white men, but 4 years earlier, some kind of disease came through and killed the entire tribe. Neighboring tribes were so surprised by the tribe's misfortune and total demise that they avoided the area, fearing that they too would be killed by the plague. As a result, no one lived on the land and no one owned it. It was another example of God's remarkable provision for the Pilgrims. Remember, they found the land, and the land was clear, and it had 4 streams in it and everything. What wonderful place to land. Well, Samoset went on to explain about the other Indian tribes in the surrounding areas. The nearest Indians lived about 50 miles south of Plymouth. They were called the Wampanoags, which means the people of the dawn. They were a friendly tribe headed by their chief, or Sachem called. His name was Massasoit. With Samoset's help, the Pilgrims planned to make contact with the braves from the Wampanoag tribes to trade for animal skins. Well, near the end of March, with the weather improving and the worst of the flu epidemic outbreak being over, the surviving Pilgrims assessed their winter losses. Several entire families had perished in the epidemic. 15 of the 19 women were dead, only 4 women alive, and only 4 couples had both spouses survive. The children had fared the best. Of 10 girls, 9 survived. So only 1 girl died, right? And only 8 of 23 boys died. So 15 boys were left. Nearly half of those who had arrived on the Mayflower now lay in shallow graves dug on a windswept hill beside the sea. Nearly half of them all were dead by the time spring came around, or March came around. Now we'll go to a new chapter here. It's called God's Perfect Provision. I've decided to end the reading here and make it a two-part thing because it's going to get a little lengthier than I thought. So this would be the end of part one. So they've so far now the Pilgrims have made it to America. They landed at Plymouth. They went through the winter. Half of them died here, and now we're going to see what happens in the spring, right? With the arrival of an Indian named Samoset, we're going to see how this turns. So we'll just have to wait, and you can listen to part two next.